All right, folks, in this lesson what we're going to talk about is we're going to make a comparison between or contrast what we call short-run economic growth and long-run economic growth. Okay? And so when we say economic growth, we're talking about real GDP, right? What did we learn in the last couple lessons? Well, we learned that gross domestic product is how we measure whether our economy is growing or not. When we make more stuff, that means gross domestic product has gone up. When gross domestic product goes up, that means that we're making more stuff, and if we're making more stuff, people are consuming more stuff and they are getting more utility. Okay? Now, here's the thing we need to understand is that there's this phenomenon where GDP, how GDP increases or decreases is different whether we're looking at it at what's called the short run or versus what we call the long run. And so what we're going to contrast here and compare is a concept called real GDP in the short run and real GDP in the long run. Now, we're saying real GDP, which means that we are ignoring changes in price. We are now at the point where everything's going to be all about real GDP because real GDP is just the production of stuff. Now, we measure it in money, but it's not the money that we care about. It's the stuff. It's actual piles of stuff that people are consuming, using, and getting utility from. Okay? And so here's the thing. The amount of stuff that's made in the day-to-day, okay, in the short run, is viewed differently than the amount of stuff that's made sort of over the long haul, over years and years and years. This is zooming in and looking at it very closely, and this is zooming out and looking at the general trend over time. That's what we have over here with the long run. Okay? Now, here's one of the first differences, okay, is that in the short run, real GDP fluctuates over time. What I mean by that is this, is that real GDP will go up, it'll increase, and then it'll decrease, and then it'll increase, and then it'll decrease, and then it'll increase, and it'll decrease. There's lots of fluctuations in real GDP when we look at it in the short run. But in the long run, real GDP is relatively stable with no fluctuations. In a healthy economy, real GDP in the long run is increasing only increasing. Whereas in the short run, real GDP increases and decreases. Now, because real GDP fluctuates over time in the short run, it creates high and low points in real GDP. So this pattern of real GDP fluctuating in the short run creates high and low points in output. Sometimes output is high, sometimes it's lower, high, then lower, and that's why we get like recessions and booms and things like that in the economy, is because of these high and low points in output in the economy. And that is a short-run phenomenon. That is not a long-run phenomenon. In the long run, here's the key. We have no high or low points. Now, I'm going to say it's not linear, but it is kind of linear. Okay, meaning we can understand it in a linear way, even though it actually isn't linear. But here in the principles of macroeconomics class, we can almost think of it as a straight line. And when I draw it, I'm going to draw it as a straight line, but it is increasing only. But when I draw on a graph real GDP in the short run, you're going to see that it fluctuates. It goes up sometimes, then it comes down, then it goes up, then it comes down, and that makes it a curvy line instead of a straight line. So now the question is, why is it that from one point of view, real GDP fluctuates up and down, but from another point of view, real GDP does not fluctuate at all? It just steadily increases. It's because real GDP in the short run is looked at from a particular point of view, and long run, real GDP in the long run is more of a theoretical thing. This is much more practical and realistic, and this is more theoretical, okay? And I'm going to try and explain that now. Let's focus on real GDP in the short run. See, where does real GDP come from? If we zoom in, real GDP includes all the stuff that is produced and sold. So computers and cars and food and plants, right? Tools, all different kinds of interesting stuff. Beds and services, roofs and stuff like that. Every single item that is sold in real GDP is produced and sold in a product market. So we've got this product market with a supply curve and a demand curve. And let's say that this is the product market for for food or for restaurant or food at home. Okay, groceries. Okay? Then we'll have another product market, supply and demand, okay, for cars. Then we'll have another product market, supply and demand, for computers. And we'll have another one for phones and for phone service and for healthcare and for furniture in your house. Tons of clothing, jackets. We have all of these different millions of little supply and demand curves for every single product and for every kind of product produced in the entire economy. And if you think back to Unit 1, when you think back to learning about supply and demand several lessons ago, remember that these supply and demand curves, they shift left and right, okay? They shift to the right. Here the demand curve shifts to the right. Here the supply curve shifts to the left. Here the supply curve shifts to the right, okay? And every single time a supply or demand curve shifts in some market, we have a change in equilibrium price and in quantity. So here the price went up, here the price went up, here quantity went up, but here quantity went down, here the price went down, but the quantity went up. And so we have millions of these product markets with prices fluctuating up and down, up and down, up and down. And when those prices fluctuate up and down, up and down, up and down, the quantities fluctuate and go up and down, up and down, up and down. And when we accumulate all of these millions of product markets with their quantities that are fluctuating up and down, why are their quantities fluctuating up and down? Quantities are fluctuating because of supply and demand's relationship to price. And so here our quantities are related to our prices. And so we're going to have fluctuations in quantities because we have fluctuations in prices. So because prices are fluctuating and then quantities in all of the markets are fluctuating, if you add up all of the quantities of stuff, you get all of the stuff, which is real GDP. So, since the quantities in the individual markets are fluctuating, real GDP itself is going to fluctuate in the overall economy. And that's because output is influenced by prices. Let me write that down here. Real GDP in the short run is influenced by prices as buyers and sellers make decisions in all of the markets. So here's the deal. As equilibrium quantity increases in the markets, real GDP increases. So I'm putting an up arrow here. We'll have an increase in real GDP as equilibrium quantity in markets increases. But as equilibrium quantity in all the markets decreases, real GDP will decrease. And that's the idea of real GDP in the short run. Affected by prices, it is the accumulation of the actual quantities produced and sold in all of the different product markets, and therefore, because those quantities, equilibrium quantities, increase and decrease, real GDP will increase and decrease over time. On the other hand, real GDP in the long run, which is more conceptual and theoretical, is not influenced by prices at all. It's unaffected by prices. In the long run real GDP does not care at all about fluctuations in prices, and therefore there are no fluctuations in quantity at all. Okay, so then what is affecting long-run real GDP? What is real GDP in the long run affected by? It is influenced by productive capacity. And I'll explain that in a second. All we care about with real GDP in the long run is possible output. I want you to think back to probably lesson 6 or day 6 or whatever it was, way back in Unit 1. We talked about productive capacity. We talked about the idea that there is an ideal maximum amount of stuff that can be produced in the economy. That's what real GDP in the long run is. It is the maximum amount that can be produced. Do we always produce the maximum that we can produce? No! We don't always use our resources perfectly for the maximum. Our output fluctuates, and it's affected by prices. So here's the idea. Let me give you an analogy here. Let's say that there is a carpenter, and that carpenter is able to produce 5 chairs per day, given all the wood and the tools and the time that he has to make chairs. He can make 5 chairs a day. Now, if he can make up to 5 chairs a day, then in a 5-day work week, what is his possible output? Well, he could possibly make 5 on Monday, 5 on Tuesday, 5 on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. So that's a total of 25 possible chairs, right? But that's real GDP in the long run. His possible output is 25. But in the short run, will he actually produce 25 chairs that week? Well, that really depends on whether people want to buy 25 chairs. If on Monday he's selling chairs for, let's say, $30 each, and people think that's a good price, and they say, yes, give us 5 chairs. People order 5 chairs. He'll produce 5 chairs. But then on Tuesday, he raises his price to $50 per chair. And now not as many people want chairs. They only order 3 chairs. So his output is going to fluctuate from 5 down to 3. Then on Wednesday, he says, well, I wanted to make more chairs yesterday, so I'm going to lower my price. Let's say he lowers his price to $37. And now people want more than 3. Now they're going to order 4 chairs, okay? Because the price is fluctuating, the quantity that he's going to produce is fluctuating. And so what he actually produces is different than what he is possibly capable of producing. And so real GDP in the long run is only concerned with possible output. And so now the question is, what is it that affects possible output? Well, if you go back to the lesson on productive capacity, what you'll see is, maybe you'll recall that productive capacity is affected by 2 things. Stock of factors of production, or stock of factors, which we said was the quantity of factors of production. How much land, labor, and capital do we have in this economy? How much land, how much labor, and how much capital do we have available to make stuff? And when you put together our land, labor, and capital in the United States in a particular way, there is a maximum amount of stuff that can be made. That maximum amount of stuff that can be made, given our limitations on the quantity of factors of production, that maximum amount is the real GDP in the long run, that maximum amount. The second thing that affects productive capacity is the productivity of those factors. That's the quality of the factors of production. How good are those factors of production? How much can we get out of those factors of production? So the quality of the factors of production. When we can get more out of the same factors of production, our productive capacity, our possible output goes up, and real GDP in the long run increases. And that's why the reason that real GDP is relatively stable with no fluctuations is we really don't have many fluctuations in our stock of factors and the productivity of our factors. Do we get more land, labor, and capital over time? Yes, but slowly. Do our factors of production increase in productivity? Yes, they do, but they generally do it slowly. And our stock of factors tends to only increase as our population increases, as our ability to make good use of our land, as our stock of capital increases in the economy, as the infrastructure in our economy gets better, as we have more highways and more electrical plants and more telecommunications infrastructure. Our productivity in our stock of factors increases over time. And because these things are increasing over time, our productive capacity increases over time. And as our productive capacity increases over time, our real GDP in the long run increases over time. And so what we find is that real GDP in the long run tends to only increase, it does it slowly, and it's unaffected by price at all. And now that we understand the difference between real GDP in the short run, which is actual production, and real GDP in the long run, which is possible production, we can now look at graphs of the two of them together.